Seconds turned to minutes, the cloud of red markers continuing to advance towards the battle line of the Terran front. Simmons watched the approaching cloud, seeing the small yellow circles surrounding the symbol of the Antares breached as the outskirts of the Vral fleet came within range of weapons systems, which almost instantly began to open up. There was no reason for her to smile, but yet she felt like smiling. There was no reason to laugh, but she wanted to peel with it until she couldn't hold herself upright anymore. Red markers vanished one after another, and a glance at the view screen showed her the results. Trails of blue plasma, spinning wrecks in the distance that even she could see from the sheer size of them. But even with the sheer quantity of kills her fleet was tallying up, she could see the fate of her fleet written in the mass of hulls flooding in to replace the dead. She should be grim-faced, dour, maybe even bitter. She wasn't. She was practically salivating. She watched as the leading edge of a distant battleship seemed to flash, then practically disintegrate under the weathering fire from the line. Another bright flash, and one of Antares' own mass driver cannons detonated a cruiser that split open like a ripe melon. To her side, she felt more than noticed the presence of Seven. She knew she should be wary of him. After all, he was going to be the one to kill her if everything went to plan. She should feel some sort of way about him. But for some reason, at the end of all things, she only felt clarity. As she glanced back at the table, she watched as a small blue cloud of light blue dots denoting strikecraft wings darted in and out of the Vral fleet. She could only guess at the horrible tally they were both giving and taking. Another yellow marker was passed, and she glanced down at the display as for the first time since this war started, she felt the entire railgun battlement of the Antares activate. She sucked in a breath and grinned almost ferally, knowing that the immediate area around Antares itself was being turned into a cloud of death. "Initiating Stage 4, mark!" She heard an admiral on the table call out, and she said nothing. Seven turned his head slightly but didn't speak. "Stage 4, she whispered, knowing that he alone would hear her. "Up until now we've been concentrating on trying to contain them, but now we're going to destroy them ship to ship," she said, almost leaning towards him. "We've been engaging anything that was on the outside edge, but now the focus is moving towards the main goal, cruiser class and above." Seven slowly leaned forward as he looked at the display, nodding to her words as he paid attention to the fight as it stood. The floor under her feet felt like it was practically vibrating under her feet from the sheer volume of fire Antares was putting out. "Fleet Marshal," she heard and turned to see the Admiral Liaison of First Fleet standing by. He didn't even hide the almost savage grin on his features. "First is relaying scans from the destroyer Calidus. Welcome wagon worked better than we anticipated." Simmons looked over and nodded once. "What's the news?" Simmons asked as she walked quickly over to his panel, and rapidly he brought up the scan data from the destroyer, which she could only assume was buried in the Vral fleet somewhere. She looked over the data and her flat expression finally broke. She clapped her hand on the back of the First Fleet Admiral. "That's perfect," she almost shouted, and actually laughed. As heads turned, she quickly punched in the coordinates in the battle map. "Any ship in range of this section with any damned weapon, this is a priority. Missiles, railguns, anything. And send a message out to every destroyer to relay their sensors back to us here, just in case." Seven glanced down at the data and raised a brow. And even as much as he liked thinking he was quick on the uptake, he had absolutely no idea what he was seeing. But as he glanced at the battle map, he saw the results. The red cloud of sensor contacts approaching seemed to simply erode in a small section of the advancing Vral battle line from the directed fire. He glanced over as Simmons clapped the back of the Admiral once again. He glanced to Simmons, who quickly strode back to her position, then glanced at him. "The destroyer took a scan, no shields on anything," she said. The cloud came on like a wave, seeming like it was unperturbed. Seven glanced back at the battle map, the dent in the Vral line becoming more and more noticeable as the entire Terran front battle line culled the leading edge of the Vral fleet. "All close-in missile systems ready to engage." Seven heard, and Simmons looked to the Admiral, who spoke and nodded her assent. The hull of the massive warship was lined with railgun nests, turrets, laser batteries, and over 100 of the mass driver assemblies that normally would be spinally mounted onto cruisers. The entire span of the war so far, she had not once felt the need to employ the full arsenal of the Antares. She suddenly realized she had never even ordered the use of the missile batteries before. Entire pods thundered as one, spitting out their devastating payloads, and thousands of small comets arched away from the Antares towards closing targets. This time, Simmons actually did feel the massive 80-kilometer hull seem to move under her feet. She almost laughed again. Down inside the hull of the Antares, Janet Shippen pulled back on the lever and raised the railgun pod case on her loader. The case itself held 48 rounds. "Clear," she called, not even waiting for confirmation as she put her loader in reverse. She threw the loader into forward gear a few moments later. Within a few seconds, she had the loader going at full speed, following a train of other loaders. The entire loading bay was awash with loaders like hers, carting munitions to the Antares guns and weapons pods. Foot traffic was completely restricted. The entire area was cleared. She didn't have to worry about anyone running in front of her. She turned down the hall and then speed down the passageway. She flew past dozens of pod cases, and every so often she saw one of the gun crews rush out with their own gantry lifters to take hold of one of the cases. The marker on the small map on her loader's display drew closer, and she pulled the loader into the appropriate lane to drop off the case. The door opened almost as she pulled up, and she saw Chuck Cushing rushing out with his gun crew. "What's it looking like in there?" she asked as she dropped the case directly in front of their gantry, pulling the loader back and rolling it into reverse, preparing to rejoin the convoy of loaders in the circular road back to the loading bay. Chuck rushed to help his crew secure the pod case to the gantry, then he looked up at Janet. He glanced at the case, then back to her as he started moving to the door. "They're getting closer," he said, and then he moved back to his crew, pushing the gantry back to the door. She turned her loader and waited for a gap, pulling back into the line and taking the first left she could to rejoin the artery road back to the loading bay. She heard her radio squawk in her ear. "Janet, are you still on Railroad 5? She heard in her ear the name of the road she traveled. Whoever thought of that name for the logistics arteries must have felt really clever. She pulled her transmitter down from her ceiling. "Yep," she said. "Good, finish up your run and head to Bay 2. Need to get a pack ready." She heard her crew chief in her ear. "On it," she said, knowing that if she was going to Bay 2, she was going to be loading a Sherman-class destroyer. As she pulled into the return road, she merged into the lane that would take her back to the loading bay. The narrow return road was filled with the sounds of the loaders rapidly returning from rearming runs. As she entered the loading bay, she felt something that she had never felt, an almost sideways motion. A few seconds later, she felt it again. She took the exit road to head up to Bay 2. The loading bay was almost adjacent to it, so she did not have far. She grabbed the receiver as she suddenly felt it again, a slight nudge almost. "Chief, are you there?" "Janet, go ahead." She heard her chief's voice as she pulled into Bay 2. The entire bay was designed from the ground up to house the exact class of destroyer that she was going to help prep for reload. She reached down and tapped her display, assigning herself to the loading crew and following the path her loader's display mapped out for her. "Is the ship shaking?" she asked, hoping she didn't sound ridiculous. "Yep, pods are launching," came a terse reply. She stared ahead of herself for a few long seconds as the concept of the Antares shaking sunk in. 10-4, she said, already piloting her loader into position to start preparing the pods for loading into whatever destroyer was docking soon. She tried to ignore the periodic shaking of the massive warship underneath her, but it was not easy. Suddenly she became aware of a new noise, a humming, and she looked up quickly, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from all around her. "Chief?" "Go ahead, Janet," came the reply a few moments later. "I'm hearing a noise down in the bay." She said, humming, yeah, it's the point defense batteries." The voice from the radio cut her off. Chief's voice was tight, controlled. "ETA on the Everest coming in is 5 minutes. Autoloaders ready." Her loader came to a stop for a second, then she set her features and pressed on. "They will be," she said, picking up another pod. In her ear, she could hear that her chief hadn't tuned away from her on his communications feed. She could hear voices in the background. She could hear the tones of those voices. The apprehension, the tension, but something underneath. 2, 7, and 12. It's hiding behind that dead hull. Fuck. Us. They're dropping fast. Different voices, different feeds. She could hear them all through her chief's microphone. She set down her load into the bracketed section of the assemblage, heard the sound of the klaxon that let her know that a docking was coming in. Her foot slammed down on the pedal, urging her loader to move faster, back and forth. A thin, almost membrane-like field appeared next to the titanic doors of the docking bay, and as an afterthought, she checked the atmospherics of her own loader as well as its magnetic locks to make sure they were set. As the massive doors opened, she took her foot off the loader, and she didn't need to look around the docking bay at the other loaders prepping to see they had all done the same. Most of the sound cut out, leaving only the sound of vibrations coming from the floor into her cockpit. The prow of a Vral battleship, almost parallel to the Antares, was visible not too far away. Even as she watched, it was joined by another Vral ship, then another. She snapped herself out of it and jumped back to her assignment even as the noise of the comms flitted into her ear. She picked up another pod, gunning her loader to get it into position, even as her eyes cut over. The very Vral battleship she had first seen suddenly flashed, so brightly she saw stars. As her vision cleared, she could see the entire forward section split open, and a few seconds later secondary explosions ripped through the hull. A shadow fell across her, and only then did she notice the Sherman-class destroyer rapidly sliding into the bay. Titanic arms from the bay walls went through automated processes as the Sherman slid fully into the Antares, mag locking to key positions on its hull and guiding it. She loaded another pod into position, then keyed her code into one of her panels in her loader, greenlighting her part in this as complete. Even as she backed out her loader, the pods she had placed were already being raised via lift to the side of the destroyer, ready to be drawn into the hull. Across the loading bay, other lifts were beginning to rise. "Chief," she said into her microphone as she turned the loader, watching as her lift reached its loading position. The pods she had loaded quickly drawn into the waiting destroyer's opening hatches by automated loading arms. "Where to next?" Another flash caught her attention, and her breath caught as she saw not one of the ugly hulls of the Vral, but several now out of the open bay. Impacts rippled across shields, explosions dotted hulls. But now she could see the blooms of return fire against Antares' own shields. "Stay there, we've got another coming, ETA 5 minutes. She heard him reply over the sound of the other voices now in her ear. She glanced up at the destroyer in the bay. Already most of the lifts had delivered their payloads. She swore as she saw her own lift lowering and set off to meet it with a fresh pod. Almost out of pure curiosity, she checked what the pod contained, then noticed it was point defense ammunition for the destroyer's missile defense and fighter defense systems. Even as she reached the pods, picking up another and moving it towards the lift, preparing for the next load, she could hear the comms over her chief's open line. The Vral had pushed forward, and all around her at that very moment, the massive maw of the Vral fleet was swallowing them. The light cruiser's engine glow guttered out, and before they had even turned away, it was already drifting, touring into yet another piece of interstellar debris that would orbit this system. The Vral aboard, if they were even still alive, were not a concern to the crew of the Dampier, but just in case another salvo of 130 railgun rounds were sent through the housing. 24 impact points suddenly set off a cascade of eruptions throughout the hull of the light cruiser, but there was no celebration on the Dampier for the kill. As a matter of fact, no one even remembered it a second later. The Dampier lunged back into full throttle. Conrad was pushed back into his seat as Cass was already calling out the next target, the Dampier's engine positively growling as they arched up, Rev and Dev cycling their guns and already opening fire. The sound of heavy metal thrummed through the tight halls and corridors of the Corvette. Bats was almost frantically working at his console, trying to do all he could do keep track of the absolute tidal wave of weapon systems that could be pointed in their direction, doing all he could to keep those that were baffled by the Corvette's limited electronic warfare suite. Granted, this was the only thing that was good about this situation. Conrad's crew could just fire at just about anything that moved in this sea of vessels. On the other hand, the Vral had to be very careful when shooting at the small and nimble Corvette. Conrad was constantly looking around, seeing the external feeds of the Dampier through his headset. He tried not to think about how lucky they had been so far. The Dampier still had shields, still had not lost any maneuverability. "Fidget!" Conrad yelled as he jerked his controls to avoid a Vral destroyer that was angling after someone else. Fighting the urge to peel off and assist whoever the destroyer was going after, even the concept of trying that was ridiculous. Even now, Conrad was trying to lose the dozen or so Vral corvettes that had been trying to chase them down. Fat chance of them catching up, however. "Chill, I'm sending it to your TAC feed," Fidget called, answering Conrad's question with a blue marker on his headset that denoted the position of a ship. His vision was a flood of dark red outlines over Vral ships' space and soft blue outlines detailing called targets of other ships. "It's the Denovio. They'll be ready for us in 5. Conrad grunted in response, wondering if that ship would still be there in 5 minutes or if they'd need another docking port. The tender vessels were just as enveloped as the rest of them. The Vral fleet had completely overtaken and surrounded them. That had been expected. The Dampier arched over in a tight and controlled spatial ascent, and as they did, Conrad could hear Rev yelling out that their shields were collapsing. Knowing the light cruiser that Cass had them hunting must have either already taken more than a few hits. Conrad focused on the cruiser, intending on crossing the cruiser's T just behind its engine cowling and hopefully disabling it without having to bleed off too much speed. Suddenly, the Vral ship was outlined by a light blue marker, and Conrad was on the verge of calling out to Fidget to ask why the battleship Seattle was locked onto a ship they should have marked as their target. A second later, it didn't matter. In the vacuum of space, it almost looked like the very atoms of the cruiser itself erupted on its center line, its forward half spinning away. Conrad actually flinched at the sight. "Holy shit," Rev called out. "That one wasn't us." "Fidget," Conrad called out. "I didn't have a chance to mark it, was getting our reload set up." Fidget called out. "Got another one lined up," Cass said, even as Conrad pulled the ship out of its arch. "Chill," Bat's voice cut in. "We've got a lock on. Get us the fuck out of here." His voice cracked, and that was all that Conrad needed to hear to know that whatever they had gotten the attention of was a serious threat. He yanked hard on the controls, throwing the throttle forward and feeling himself thrown to the side as he pulled the Dampier into a full-powered turn. "Marking it!" Bats yelled out, even as the red haze of a weapon's lock signature showed on the edges of Conrad's vision. "Battleship!" Bats yelled out. "Hold on," Conrad yelled. Then he suddenly cut the throttle, shoving the controls hard to send the Dampier into a dead spin through the 0G of the battlefield. As the Dampier turned to its right as it flew forward, Conrad stole a glance back at the glaring scarlet marker, seeing the massive hull that had locked onto them. He breathed in, then suddenly hammered the throttle to full again. His body was thrown physically to the right, and he heard his crew respond as the Dampier roared down the side of another Vral battleship's hull, cutting the targeting vessel's lock on them. "Chill," he heard Mad Doc's voice in his ear. "Crispy's going to stab you if you don't warn him next time. Better a Chua knife than a Vral laser battery." Conrad growled into his headset. As the Dampier thundered down the hull of the battleship, he cut the throttle again and flipped the Dampier around so it was facing away from the direction it was headed. As they came to the rear of the battleship Conrad had just used to break sensor lock, Conrad yelled out, "What are you two waiting for an invitation?" Rev and Dev both began to fire. All 24 of the Dampier's rail guns began to tear into the engine housing of the battleship. It was unlikely they would cripple it, but they would most certainly hurt it a little, and frankly that was all that mattered. Looking at the battleship through the Dampier's eyes, he could see it fire a salvo of larger missiles, and a spark of realization hit him as he looked in the direction that the missiles were flying. No, not missiles. Torpedoes, boarding torpedoes, and at the end of their trajectory a Terran front battleship, the Ottawa. Conrad pulled the Dampier into pursuit. "Fidget, tell the Ottawa they've got boarders coming." He almost felt Fidget looking back at him after a moment of silence. Then he looked at the Ottawa again, pressing a stud to zoom in as much as he could. After only a second he noticed, then whispered, "Shit." The Ottawa was drifting, and even as he watched it was being latched onto by other boarding torpedoes. Several others were firing retros, others were securely attached. It only took him a second to realize what was happening to that ship even now. A moment of dreadful certainty washed over him, and he pulled the Dampier into a rapid climb after the boarding torpedoes. Rev and Dev didn't even ask, firing their railguns as soon as they could lock on. He could hear Fidget speaking rapidly. "Chill," he heard Cass's voice, soft, almost soothing. "Keep fucking firing," Conrad yelled as he shoved hard on the throttle as if he could get the Dampier to go faster by sheer force of will alone. Rev and Dev picked off the torpedoes one at a time, small flashes even as bats began to yell that a corvette was pulling in behind them. "Chill," he heard Cass's voice, more insistent. "Target the ones attaching to the hull," Conrad yelled, ignoring Cass even as Rev and Dev finished off the troop-filled boarders, then began to shift their targets. Suddenly he heard someone moving. He felt someone grab hold of his jumper and turned his head, seeing Cass's face through the darkened glass, looking at her through the image of the Viral fleet that was in that direction. "They're gone," Cass whispered. "We can," Conrad began, but Cass tightened her grip. "Conrad," she whispered softly, barely heard over the sound of the Dampier's reactor and the loud music blaring over the speakers. "They are gone." Conrad's eyes turned back forward, his head turning back to the stricken Ottawa. He had known what would happen in this battle. He had known they would lose. He had known the Vral fleet would move on from here to crash into the rock that was stationed Thermopylae. The Ottawa was drifting, defenseless, and now was being boarded. The crew would meet them, fight from station to station. They'd fight them in the mess halls they ate in the very rooms they slept in, and they would meet their end by the guns the Vral carried or those knives they used. "Their reactor is offline," Bats called out. "They don't even have auxiliary power." No auxiliary power, which meant that the entire ship was in the dark, silent, save for the sounds of the fighting in the dead of space. The crew of the Ottawa would be slaughtered on their own ship. Conrad made a small sound that turned into a frustrated scream. "God fucking damn it," he roared. Then he turned the Dampier away from the Ottawa, leaving it to its fate. He felt Cass quickly move away, sliding back into her chair, and he saw a new target appear on his screen, even as the Dampier was jarred by a weapon's impact. "Kill that corvette shooting at us," he swore, then he arched towards his new target. He suddenly became aware of the non-Vral hulls that were drifting through space. It was a sudden slap in the face. How had he not noticed the losses the fleet had taken before now? "Resupply is ready for us," Fidget called out suddenly, and Conrad immediately peeled off, even as Rev and Dev's target indicators switched back to front where he could see their aim. Apparently they had killed the corvette chasing them. He put the Denovio in the crosshairs of the Dampier's prow and the ship shot straight towards the distant tender. Rev and Dev were using the last of the ammunition that they could as they moved, firing at targets of opportunity. He felt Cass's hand on his shoulder and he turned off his microphone, not looking to her, making sure he didn't fly them into the side of another ship as he rushed towards the tender ship. "I'm fine," he whispered, and Cass's hand flattened on his shoulder. "How many ships have we lost so far?" "No idea," he heard her whisper, "but we're still fighting." Her hand stayed on his shoulder for a moment longer before she moved back to her gunnery chair. He heard her restraints click back in over the sound of the music. Then he heard Bats yell out. The red haze was bright on the edges of his screen, and he didn't need Bats to tell him what had locked onto them. The scarlet edge of the ship was on the corner of his vision, and his head snapped to look at it just in time to see the batteries of a Vral cruiser open up on his ship at a range that even they couldn't miss at. It was funny, he always thought in a time like this he would have time to yell out something like, "Brace!" or at the very least, "Incoming." The entire ship felt like it had been hit by a hammer thrown by a giant. Dev screamed even as Conrad's vision spun widely, the Dampier's shields barely taking the hit. "Hold on!" he yelled, trying to bring the corvette under control, smoothing the spin the volley had put them in and looking around for some other ship to dive behind, some way to break out from under the gaze of the cruiser that they had gotten the notice of. He threw the ship's throttle back, turning it completely off, then yanked the thrusters around. "Sorry, Crispy," he yelled. Then he shoved the throttle forward again. The world suddenly spun crazily, and the dark glass that fed him the external feeds went out. The lights on the bridge went out. Everything went dark. He pushed on the controls, the throttle. Then suddenly he realized he didn't have control. He felt his body rising out of the seat, the artificial gravity failing. The sound of the music went silent on the bridge, and outside the ship the stars spun lazily as the Dampier began to drift. Conrad stared out of the small viewport, even as the auxiliary power kicked on. He pulled the headset off and looked to Cass in the soft light of the reserves began to shine from small bulbs in the overhead. Fidget looked back at him from where he was sitting with his darkened console. Conrad breathed out, then leaned forward. He waited for the end. And waited. Slowly, Conrad leaned back and looked up. Still nothing. He was on the verge of asking Bats if they were still locked on by the Vral cruiser, but knew that was pointless. Bats's console was just as dark as everything else now. Conrad slowly looked to Cass, her face pale in the stark white glow. They were all waiting for the Vral to finish them. Seconds ticked by as the Dampier drifted. After an eternity, Conrad breathed out in a rush, not realizing he had been holding his breath. "All right," he whispered, looking back at the small viewports at the front of the bridge, seeing them slowly spinning through the stars, almost end over end. He pushed himself out of his seat. "Cass, come on. Everyone else, stand by." He pulled himself through the tight corridor, realizing to his surprise how much easier it was to navigate the tight spaces without gravity being a concern. As they were alone, he heard Cass behind him. "Do you think they'll board us?" After a few moments, Conrad whispered, "No, we were at near top speed. They'd have to catch us first, and they don't have anything that can." Even now, he knew that at any time they could crash into another ship, but he pushed it out of his head. As he came into the engineering section, he could already see Doc's back, hovering as he quickly bandaging Cross's forehead. Cross glanced up, then directed Conrad with his eyes to the doorway. Conrad moved past with Cass close behind. Conrad almost ran face first into Crash. "Chill," Crash said as they both stopped themselves as they drifted. "Crispy busy?" Conrad asked, looking past him towards the reactor room. Crash nodded quickly. "That hit knocked the reactor completely out of alignment. We're in one piece, more or less. Smokey is already working on the relays to get them ready for reactor kickoff." Crash turned and motioned to the reactor room. "Crispy is back there with BB, but the little guy is pissed as hell right now. Are we in trouble?" "No idea. We're completely down right now," Conrad admitted. "We're drifting. We were on the way to a tender when we got hit. Did Crispy say how long it would take to get the reactor back online?" Crash shook his head to the negative. Then he pointed back at the reactor room before moving past Conrad and Cass. Conrad took the hint, and as soon as Crash squeezed past him, he pushed himself in the 0G down the passage to the reactor room. Before he even got in, he heard the translator struggling to keep up with the string of trills, clicks, and whistles coming from the Chua reactor technician. Bee's back was to him, her hair floating as she quickly reached behind herself while holding a bright light on whatever was in front of her. From the direction of the what he could only assume was the Chua version of an expliciative-ridden rant, it was Crispy. He heard the noise from the small Chua stop, heard him sniff the air audibly twice. "Human!" the Chua positively shrieked. "What you do?" BB grabbed hold of the wall as Crispy climbed up her arm to her shoulder in the lack of gravity, pointing a tool at Conrad. "You let Vral!" The Chua spouted off a series of clicks and warbles that didn't translate, and Conrad actually blinked. "Shoot ship! Do again, you fix!" He positively roared. Then he pushed off of BB's shoulder back to the component he was working on. BB turned her head and looked back at Conrad. "I think he means we'll be able to get the reactor back online." She raised her eyebrows. Then another rapid chitters exploded out of the Chua in response. "He says it'll take time, 30 minutes, maybe an hour." Conrad glanced over to Cass, the unspoken truth going between them. Conrad looked back to BB and nodded. "We'll leave you to it then," he said. Then he motioned to the door. Cass floated, then pulled herself back through it, pushing through the adjoining room. Doc glanced at them as they passed, slapping Cross's back, who pulled himself away and took hold of a tool bag. As they entered the passage, Doc was hot on their heels. 30 minutes minimum," Conrad said, looking back at Cass. "How screwed are we then?" Doc asked, looking between the two of them. Cass and Conrad were silent for a few moments. Then Cass whispered, "Do you remember where we were pointed?" Conrad nodded. Then he took his finger and painted an invisible picture on the bulkhead as he spoke. "We were heading for a tender on the outer edge of the fight. We've been down." Conrad paused for a moment, and Doc pulled up his wrist. 4 minutes. The surly medic muttered, "Okay, 4 minutes." Conrad said, doing some quick thinking, "We were pointed so I could retro and match the speed of the tender, but we're drifting out. This way," he said, making a motion with his finger, "which means we're either on the outer edge of the engagement or we're completely out of it at this point." Conrad slowly pushed back from the wall, seeing the Dampier in his mind flying through space. "Good news is either way, we're not dead. Better news is we'll be able to get back online." "In 30 minutes, Cass whispered, then she looked to Conrad. Both of them were silent, another unspoken conversation going on between them. "Which, if you're right, means it's going to take us another 30 to get back into the fight. An hour." "This fight isn't be a fight for another hour," Doc grumbled, giving voice to what Cass and Conrad had both been thinking. Silence fell between the three, then Doc looked between them. "Am I right?" Cass looked up at him, her expression uncharacteristically stern. "What? It's true. It's not like we didn't know what was going to happen here. The only question is, what are we going to do when we get power back?" Doc motioned to the both of them. "Don't act like you both don't know that at some point Antares is going to order anyone who can cut and run to go to Thermopylae." Cass and Conrad looked to each other. Both of them had considered the same thing. "If it comes to that and we come back up and get those orders, then we'll do just that," Conrad said, and for a moment he felt actually sick to his stomach. He saw the stricken hull of the Ottawa in his mind. For a moment he thought about the Antares, floating in space, covered in landers and boarding ships, dotted with boarding torpedoes. He felt like throwing up. Moments later, a Vral weapons operator glanced at the Dampier as it drifted past, slowly tumbling through space, and disregarded it as just another wreck. A few moments after that, it passed beyond the effective range of the last Vral ship that could have cared. They had other prey. The Dampier shot off into the dark, slowly beginning a long orbit of the system's star, riding the outer system edge.